I'm Christian. I come from a charismatic, non-denominational background. Currently, I study at the Scandinavian School of Theology in Uppsala, Sweden. I'm studying for a Bachelor of Theology, and been studying the issue of the Temple Mount, and specifically as it relates to Christian theology and thinking, more specifically biblical theology. I'm not going to be quoting so many sources on what particular theologians or church fathers think or have thought about the temple, because I think most people who are Christians are aware of the general feeling that you grew up with, or whatever your ideas or notions are about the Temple Mount. So I'm going to address, when we speak about the Temple Mount, there are a few questions that pop up in Christian people's mind fairly quickly when it comes to the Temple Mount, both biblically and in today in Jerusalem. So for a Jewish audience, this is not directed towards you, or for a secular audience, I have different questions. But for a Christian audience, people wonder, one of the things they wonder about is, what about the temple of Antichrist? Or, well, what about the sacrificial system? Or different questions like that. So those are a couple of big topics that I'd like to touch on at this session, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. So you guys can ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer. I don't know everything, but whatever I have, I'm glad to share. So, let's see here. Let me just take some time so I see how long I'm going. All right. How about we start off with, what about the Temple of Antichrist? Because when we talk about Jewish support for the Temple Mount, a lot of Christians get concerned that if the Jews have control over the Temple Mount, they may rebuild the temple. First of all, Cry for Zion is not a movement advocating for the rebuilding of the temple or anything like that. We're just asking for the law to be respected on the Temple Mount, for Jews to be able to pray, for Christians not to be discriminated against, or anyone else for that matter, but that Israeli law would rule on the Temple Mount as it should. That said, however, the Jewish people will justly administrate the site in the future as they see fit, and in a just manner that may someday, only God knows, include a future temple. That's one thing. But we will stick with the theological questions. So, the misunderstanding about the temple of Antichrist comes from primarily two passages in the New Testament. So the first one is going to come from Matthew 24, verses 15 through 16. And I can read them for you, or if you have a Bible. Well, it's not quite a church service, so I won't get on to you about forgetting a Bible. So it says, and what's happening is that Jesus is speaking on the Mount of Olives in his great eschatological discourse. He's looking out over the Temple Mount, over Jerusalem, and he says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So that's one passage. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you just quote it by itself, but we'll explain more. The second passage is from the Apostle Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, where he gives kind of a short discourse about the day of the Lord, the return of the Lord, and about the Antichrist. And it says, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So, both of these passages suggest that before the end of this age,
which verse would it be in
2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 4. So, both of these passages suggest that before the end of this age, an abomination or the Antichrist or something like that could defile God's holy temple in Jerusalem. And so for this reason, Christians generally want no part of a temple or the Temple Mount or that whole issue, because isn't that the temple of Antichrist, they say. So this misses, first of all, a very, very, very important point theologically. The Apostle Paul is saying here that this is specifically God's temple in this passage. It's not some other guy's temple. It's not some evil king's temple. It's not somebody else's temple. And even already in 180 CE, Irenaeus, the church father, I said I wouldn't quote a lot of that stuff, but I'll quote this one. This was very interesting. Irenaeus, who is the spiritual grandson of John the Apostle. So we got John the Apostle, and one of the hearers of him, and then one of his disciples is Irenaeus. And he's writing in Against Heresies in his book, and he's saying, if you want the quotes, Against Heresies 5:25-2, he's saying like this, that the Apostle Paul also has pointed out this which I have shown in many ways, that the temple in Jerusalem was made by the direction of the true God. For the Apostle himself, that's Paul, speaking in his own person, distinctly called it, quote, the temple of God, referring to 2 Thessalonians 2:4. So he goes on. So already that was an issue in his day in the 2nd century to point out to Christians, look, I know the temple's destroyed, but in the future it seems like it'll be rebuilt. But this temple is God's temple. It's not the Antichrist's temple, okay? That's what Irenaeus is trying to get at. It's the same issue today. Now, in order to understand the context of both of these passages, we need to see them from their real historical context. The New Testament was written by Jewish people, okay? And they had background information, which was very common to them. And both of these passages have to do with the Jewish story of Hanukkah. Today, we are actually gathered during the festival of temple dedication, the festival of Hanukkah. And how many here have not heard the story of Hanukkah? Anybody? Okay, good. Well, for those who haven't heard it, maybe on the live stream, basically, in short, about 180 years before the time of Jesus, during the days of the Greek Empire, the Greek king, Syrian Greek king up in Syria, where he was ruling from, Antiochus Epiphanes, began to great persecution of the Jewish people. And he invaded Judea and sacked Jerusalem. And specifically, he even stormed into the Holy Temple, and he put up a statue of Zeus with his own face on it on top of the altar of sacrifice, and he sacrificed a pig and splashed the blood into the temple, and he started cutting up the Torah scrolls, the sacred biblical scrolls, and basically began a great persecution of the Jewish people. And he called himself Theos Epiphanes, God manifest. So he's making divine claims, basically, right? And the statue that he put up in the temple had his face on it. So this is obviously harsh paganism, right? And he also went around to different towns, his troops, and demanded pagan sacrifice, that everyone Hellenize and all the Jewish people abandon their religion and worship the Greek way. And he actually had dreams of resurrecting Alexander the Great's empire, right? So, however, some faithful Levitical priests, the Maccabees, they revolted and miraculously threw out all the superpower of their day out of the country, and they cleansed the temple and they rededicated it. Now, the prophet Daniel specifically predicted in detail all this story about Antiochus Epiphanes. So much so that secular scholars will not accept that the book of Daniel was written before the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Because it's in such detail. So they all date the book after, because surely he couldn't predict in such detail the story of Hanukkah, which is where secular and believing Bible scholars obviously differ quite a bit. So Anyway, the story is there in Daniel, and it's in that context that Jesus is quoting in Matthew 24 about when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and so on. So he's specifically referring to the Hanukkah story described by Daniel. And this had already happened. The idol had been set up in the temple, and the one that Daniel calls the abomination that makes desolate. And the unique thing about Jesus' prediction is that something like that would occur in the future. Whether in imagery, whether for real life, we don't know exactly how, but that something like that could happen in the future, right? That's the whole point. But here's the interesting, here's the thing for Christian theology to think about. The second temple was rebuilt according to the express direction of God in the Bible. Even though Daniel had prophesied that it would be desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes, right? So, but still, it was God's will and wish in the Bible that it be rebuilt. And, he moved on King Cyrus. He moved on the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to encourage the rebuilding. Godly men like Zerubbabel rebuilt it. So, how could it be that a rebuilding of a future temple be different from that circumstance? If Jesus is alluding to something like that happening in the future, why would it go against the rebuilding of the temple? The temple was not built for Antiochus Epiphanes. It was built for God. Antiochus Epiphanes had it for a brief little period. Okay, it was cleansed and rededicated. That's one thing. A second thing, Christian scholars differ on the situation with the Antichrist and the abomination, desolation that Jesus spoke about. Maybe it was the Roman Empire leader who destroyed the temple. They put up their pagan emblems inside the temple and they sacrificed to them up on the Temple Mount. So some Christian scholars believe that was already what Jesus was talking about or Paul was talking about. Opinions differ on that. But the main point is there is no controversy when it comes to Christian theology or New Testament theology and the Temple Mount or the temple when it comes to the issue of the temple, so-called temple of Antichrist, God forbid. So that's one common objection that Christians have. Was that more or less clear? Making sense? Save your questions if you have them. Write them down somewhere, and we can have some more fun during Q&A. So let's get to an even tougher topic. How about that? And you have some of the notes for this. Specifically, I know these are big topics, so we gave you all who registered a resource magazine that addresses some of these issues so that you can study yourself, see what you think. It's a Christian edition resource that we put out. So what about the temple sacrifices? This is a big, touchy, very difficult topic for Christians. So, like I said before, we're not advocating for anything crazy or radical here. We're talking about theology as it relates to the Temple Mount. Because immediately when you think about the Temple Mount, you think of, as a Christian, sacrifices, incense, the sacrificial service, the temple service, the offerings. So, if you're not, how should I say? We need to take a fresh look at this. Is a very touchy topic. So it touches on deep core issues, the view of Christians on the whole matter of atonement, on salvation. If you're not Christian here, this will be fun education for you, but it's not meant to disturb you in any way. I don't mean to step on anybody's toes, but we're just going to dive into it, okay? So we all have a different worldview. Sacrifices have been with us since the beginning. It's a natural human reflex. We could mention that Let's see here. Let's see if I have the stats here. Roughly 1/4 of the world holds to faiths which still practice literal sacrifice today. It's not as if it was just a bygone thing and it's gone. It's been with us since the beginning. It's still with us today. Christians who are, Bible-believing Christians, still believe in the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, right? And Christians who might be uncomfortable with the biblical concept or the Jewish concept of sacrifice, Jewish people might be just as uncomfortable with the concept of what seems like a human sacrifice of Jesus. Everybody's uncomfortable. Okay? But can we look at this in a fresh way from the biblical texts and from the New Testament? I think we can. So, first off, if the whole topic is just nauseating you, and you start reading the biblical texts begin to teach about priests throwing blood around and cutting out the fat surrounding the diaphragm and the 2 kidneys, we tend to become maybe more nauseated than blessed, to quote a good Bible teacher. So a lot of people's first objection is kind of like a conscientious vegetarian, which a lot of Israelis are. But that unless you are a conscientious vegetarian, that's not an objection you get to make. It's just that modern man is so removed from the food process, you don't think about the carnage that took place to get you a burger, right? So it's clear that neither Jesus or the apostles or the other heroes of the Bible were vegetarian. They weren't. If you are, that's fine, but maybe before Noah and so on. So that's not really a biblical stance you can take. And if you honestly read the scriptures, God doesn't say he's nauseated by them. He commanded them, and he keeps saying they are a pleasing fragrance aroma to the Lord. That doesn't seem like very nauseating negative language, even if maybe we don't understand it. Another objection that people have to the sacrifices, and this is a very common Christian one, is that God actually hated it. And he always hated it all along. It was a temporary thing that he maybe cursed the Jewish people with to have to do for a while. But until that era could be done away with. So they'll take famous texts like David's great psalm of repentance after the situation with Bathsheba. He writes this psalm, and he says, in the psalm, he says, "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." So Christian theologians have taken passages like this and said, this is what the text is really about. God never really liked those sacrifices. This is what he wants. But the very next verses in Psalm 51 say, "Do good to Zion in your good pleasure, build up the walls of Jerusalem, then will you delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings, then bulls will be offered on your altar." So it's clearly a misuse of the text to try to use it in that negative manner. It's obviously God is after the heart of the worshiper. It's not the worship form in itself that he's against, it's the attitude of the one bringing the offering that he's really trying to get at. You can find lots of similar stuff in the prophets from Jeremiah, Hosea, Malachi, and specifically Amos has a really harsh critique that's been used by church fathers quite a bit. And I would like to imagine that Amos was speaking in a Christian context to a church. And what he said might sound something like this. I despise your Sunday services, and I take no delight in your communion table. Even though you collect your tithes and offerings, I will not accept them. And the praise and worship team, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your drums. To the melody of your guitars, I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So that's kind of gives us a different flavor of the text, and that's maybe more how it was intended. It's not targeted at the liturgical forms in themselves. It's obviously the heart that God and the prophets are addressing here. So I think it's a misuse of the biblical text to try to insist that God always hated what he himself commanded and said he took pleasure in. It just doesn't. If you want to talk about theology, you talk about the immutability of God, the fact that God is forever the same. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever, who was and who is to come. His essential character cannot change, or it would not be God. At least not the God of the Bible. So, before Christians become too uncomfortable, the one thing I would like every Christian to know is that in the Bible, in the New Testament, there is no conflict whatsoever between the sacrificial service in the temple and the Gospels, and the gospel, the atoning death of Jesus. There's no conflict between them. So I'll explain what I mean by that. A lot of Christians, and I grew up with a certain amount of this pop theology, you could say, that before Jesus came, people, their eternal salvation, the redemption of their eternal soul, was gained through the sacrifices, through people offering animals. But after Jesus came, he offered, basically, he was a righteous man who died. He was completely righteous, and God chose to allow him to die and accept his death in place of the punishment that we all deserve. That's classic Christian theology, right? But we sometimes labor under the impression that before he came, the Bible taught that that went through the sacrifices in the temple. But if you think about that, that would mean that Jesus didn't need to come at all. You could just keep bringing those animals and we would all be fine. And he didn't actually save anybody. He just saved us a lot of inconvenience of going to the temple or building an altar or offering animals. Biblically speaking, the path to eternal salvation has always gone through repentance and faith. Turning away from evil, placing faith in God. That's always been the path from Adam, Abraham, on through the New Testament, all throughout the text. So, Paul even refers to Abraham, right? In the classic passages in Romans, Paul uses Abraham as the test case for how he teaches the disciples of Jesus about eternal redemption, salvation in faith. Abraham is the father of us all because of his faith. He had faith and it was counted unto him as righteousness because he put his faith in God. So if Abraham, before Jesus came, is the test case for salvation by faith, we need to also understand that Abraham certainly built altars and offered animals. Right? So that was not in conflict. And the idea that salvation before Jesus came through the animal sacrifices, most serious theology won't entertain that. But it's very popular among people in the pews, if you understand what I'm saying. So, the next thing we need to do to approach this topic is to just accept the facts as the New Testament gives them, which is not so easy. Because a lot of times we don't read, we kind of gloss over some passages in the Scriptures. So, a few things here to note in the New Testament. Jesus seemed to have had no problem with sacrifices. Specifically in the Sermon on the Mount, he taught about how to properly bring them. In Matthew 5:23, he speaks about if you have something against, between you and your brother, you leave your sacrifice there by the altar, you go fix your thing, and then when your heart is right, you come back and you bring your offering, right? It says in Luke 22:15 that he eagerly desired to eat the roasted Passover lamb sacrifice with his disciples. Now, I know he meant a lot more than just he wanted the food, right? But the fact remains, it was a Passover sacrifice that was slaughtered in the temple. The blood was splashed upon the altar. So there's that issue that we just need to accept and take this text into account as we build our theology. He also promised that he would not partake of the Passover lamb again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God, which suggests a future again where he would partake. So after his ascension, his apostles and disciples, and this is where we really get into it, is we see in the book of the Acts of the apostles about the story of Jesus' followers after him. How did they interact with the temple and the Temple Mount? This is a fascinating story. And for the life of me, I do not understand what Christian theology has completely passed us by. It's absurd to me, because it's on every page, almost. There's a brief period where Paul is like outside the land of Israel, like traveling around on his journeys. But beyond that, it's all Temple Mount, temple centered, okay, in Jerusalem. So it says in Acts 2:46, 3:1, in Luke 24:53, again, you have these references in your notes. They eagerly participated in the temple services. They made it their daily. They were continually in the temple blessing God. They made the temple their daily, not weekly, daily meeting place. So we even read in Acts 6, verse 7, that several of the Levitical priests, that many of them became disciples of Jesus, and there's no indication here that they stopped their service in the temple. They probably became his disciples, and the sacrifices became even more. Their temple service and everything they were doing became even more interesting to them. But if we cut to the chase, what most Christians are interested in knowing is, what did Paul think? Because Christian theology, honestly, and I say this sadly because it's not healthy for theology, begins and ends with Paul. What did he think? How did he teach? And this is something that when you reject replacement theology, you try to give up. It's this idea that you take what Paul said and you put that as the foundation of all theology, and then you interpret Jesus out from and his apostles out from what you read from Paul, and then you interpret the prophets from that, and then you interpret whatever's old, really old in the Old Testament out from what Paul thought. You put the whole thing, the whole house upside down. What you need to do is you need to begin from the beginning of the book. And once you do that, there's only a certain number of ways you can understand Paul in order to make him fit. But if you take however you wish to read Paul, and then cram all the other biblical text, all of it, into the way you read Paul, you can come up with all sorts of ideas. However, we have a ton of evidence in the book of Acts how Paul interacted with the temple and the temple sacrifices. This is so fascinating to me. And in fact, it's very interesting that in the theological world, the Jewish scholars, I'm not talking about necessarily religious here, but secular biblical scholars in universities and such, they accept the historicity of the book of Acts a lot more than sometimes secular, but mostly Christian Bible scholars, who are critical scholars, will approach the book of Acts. In fact, the book of Acts is the oldest Jewish mention that there is of the traditional Torah and prophets reading among the Jewish people. It's the oldest historical source. You can find it in the Jewish Encyclopedia and so on, which they find accords completely with Jewish history, a lot of the details in the book of Acts. But a lot of secular scholars have a hard time with his historical account in the book of Acts because they don't see how Paul's letters, all the letters he wrote, fits in with the life description you see in the book of Acts of the life of Paul. And they have a hard time, but there's a whole new school of scholarship called post-supersessionist scholarship. That just means post-supersessionist is scholarship. I belong to that group And that means you've rejected replacement theology. In theological circles, replacement theology is actually called supersessionism. It means that Jesus, the New Testament, all that stuff, all the Christian stuff, the church, everything superseded all the Old and the Old Testament and Jewish and so on. So there's a whole new school of scholarship among the most respected scholars you can find that are post-supersessionist. And they don't read Paul's letters that way anymore. And it's causing them to reevaluate Paul's life in the book of Acts. But let's dive into it. So in Acts 21, after many years after Paul has had his encounter on the road to Damascus, after becoming a disciple of Jesus, after writing many of his famous letters, he comes to Jerusalem. And he was fulfilling a Nazirite vow at the time, the book of Acts tells us. He had shaved his head, was under a vow, and he was going to complete it in the temple. Already right there, you're starting to encroach on some very Torah temple issues. And when he comes to Jerusalem, there's a big disturbance because he has been telling Gentiles that they can believe in the God of Israel, but they don't have to legally convert to become Jewish to come into that relationship with the God of Israel through the Messiah of Israel, the King of Israel. And so he's telling them, don't circumcise. The prophets said that in the end of days, the Gentile nations would stream and they would turn toward God. They would turn toward the God of Israel and start serving the God of Israel and rejecting idolatry. But if you all become Jewish, if you all convert and circumcise, those prophets won't be fulfilled. It'll just become Jewish people who serve God. So he tells them, don't convert to become legally Jewish. But when he comes to Jerusalem, he's been preaching that so much, and there's a lot of Jews among the nations where he preaches. When he comes to Jerusalem, the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem are saying, look, we have a problem. Everybody thinks you're telling Jewish people this stuff. And you're telling Jewish people not to circumcise, telling Jewish people not to follow the Torah, telling Jewish people they should give up their customs. So we know this is not true about you, they say in Acts 21. But in order to prove that, we have a few more other of Jesus' disciples, Jewish disciples here in Jerusalem, who are under a Nazirite vow. Pay for all their sacrifices in the temple when you go to finish your Nazirite vow. And Paul says, great. Let's do it. And this will put to rest the whole misunderstanding, which has been the reigning Christian theological misunderstanding for 2,000 years, by the way, but that aside. And it says in Acts 21:26, then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So some, like John Wesley, was a very important Christian figure in Christian history, whom I appreciate. He understood this as Paul he was buckling under the pressure of the social pressure, under the other brothers who didn't understand. Others suggest that Paul was practicing some sort of sanctified deception here. That he was going along with this. He pretended to be Jewish while he was with Jewish people. He pretended to be Gentile when he was with Gentiles, and so on. That's way too big of a topic for us to jump into, but I would recommend very much a work by David Rudolph, A Jew to the Jews. Excellent book to deal with this topic. But we can so David Rudolph, A Jew to the Jews, that came out 2016 from Pickwick. He's a doctorate in New Testament from Cambridge, I believe. Excellent book. So, from the text itself, though, we can disprove that. It says in Acts 24, because after this, Paul gets arrested in the temple while this is going on. And he spends the rest of the book of Acts defending himself on trial again and again and again and again what happened in the temple. And so he says, now after several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring alms to my Jewish nation and to present offerings. He says on trial before Felix, the Roman governor at the time. And while I was doing this, they, my accusers, found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. In other words, I'm not trying to start some sort of insurrection here. And I had no problem with the Jewish situation. I was purified in the temple. I had come to Jerusalem to bring this whole donation to poor disciples in Jerusalem, but also to present sacrifices. He tells us that. That was his intention of coming to Jerusalem in Acts 24:17 and 18. So the book of Numbers tells us the list of sacrifices a Nazirite would have brought. This is actually a little key to why they asked him to pay for these other Nazirites to finish their vow, because it was very expensive. There were so many sacrifices you had to bring to finish a Nazirite vow that a lot of Nazirites couldn't afford to finish their vow. They were stuck with their long hair for a very long time, and we have Jewish records of this, that this was a rabbinical problem, and rabbis would find different ways to disqualify bad Nazirite vows so that the poor Nazirites could be done with their vow. Because it tells us, it includes, I'll just mention this from the book of Numbers, that it's about 15 sheep of various kinds, him and his 4 companions, including 5 of the lambs are specifically sin sacrifices. Very significant for Christian theology, which says after the ascension of Jesus, the sin sacrifices are an abomination somehow in the temple. Here Paul is, years later, coming with the intention to bring sin sacrifices in the temple. Christian theology has not wrestled with that fact. So it's abundantly clear from the text that Jesus and his apostles and followers, including Paul, saw no contradiction at all between faith in Jesus and the temple service. Quite the opposite, in fact. You could, scholarly approach to the book of Acts, you could call the Jesus community in Jerusalem a temple sect. It's not a negative term, it's how scholars could term it. So where did the problem come in? Why are Christians today so often so negative to the temple? So there's a few reasons, but mainly it's the way supersessionists interpreted one single book in the New Testament. And it's the epistles, ironically, it's the epistles to the Hebrews, to the Jews. So, in the epistle to the Hebrews, it is, first of all, one of the more complex books in the New Testament. Okay? It's quite deep. It contains a massive amount of allusions and quotations to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible, and it assumes a very high level of understanding in the biblical texts for the readers who are reading the text. It assumes that they know a lot about these things, and every time it quotes a passage, it alludes to the whole context about that passage. It'll quote the covenant to David or something like that, and it'll allude just a little short snippet, but it alludes to the whole situation in the Hebrew Bible. So, if you take the book of Hebrews alone, and like I said, the situation with Paul and the way the theologians use him, if you take that book alone and forget about the rest of the biblical canon and interpret it however you wish, you can come up with a lot of contradictory ideas. And that's exactly what ancient theologians did. So there's no way to dive into the book of Hebrews here today completely. I will just make 2 small approaches about the book, and I will point you to look in your notes and to look for a lot of post-supersessionist scholarship on the book of Hebrews among Bible commentators. There's lots of serious books coming out on this. And you look, it's the cutting edge of biblical scholarship, you could say. It's post-supersessionist scholarship. The debate's quite hot. It's not so much in the church all the time, but among universities and so on, this is really a hot topic. And there's lots of resources coming out. But 2 things. We'll touch on 2 ways to read the book of Hebrews and a little bit about the historical background. And then we'll start to get to Q&A. You could read the book of Hebrews as how much more, or either or. So Jesus liked to use the how much more. It's a common rabbinic method, kal vachomer, from the light to the heavy. If you, let's see if we can quote Jesus here. If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So if this is true, how much more is this true? If you take that same statement and you read it as either or, a dualistic contrast, which is very popular with the Greeks and the Greek mindset and dualistic philosophy among the Greeks, Platonic dualism and so on, which has given us other things like computers and mechanics and whatever. I'm not going to rag on that completely, but it's not a good way to approach the biblical texts because they don't think like that often. If you approach it as a dualistic either or, we could take Jesus' statement to mean that you are all evil, terrible people who hate and beat your kids and can never love them even if you tried, but God is great and he's wonderful and he loves you. That's a dualistic approach. Okay? That's not, this is true, so how much more is this true? From the lesser to the greater. That's the way that the book of Hebrews has been interpreted a lot. And I would argue that the book of Hebrews relies a lot more on the how much more argument throughout the book, quite a bit. And the author's point is basically, there's an earthly temple in Jerusalem, there's a mystical heavenly temple in the heavens. Jewish tradition agrees with this too. There's a temple on earth, it's meant to mirror the temple in heaven. And the author in Hebrews says, if this is true in the earthly temple, how much more so is it true in the heavenly temple? They are not in conflict, these two, but they form different functions. One in the heavenlies is representing the eternal salvation, the world to come. It's the author of the book of Hebrews says, it's the world to come of which we speak. And then he says, if Jesus were on earth, now he wouldn't even serve in the temple. He was from the tribe of Judah, right? They can't even serve in the temple. The author of Hebrews even bolsters the temple service several times, saying, that the ashes of the red heifer still purify for ritual bodily impurities, everything having to do with the earthly temple. So they're not in conflict, is my point. Secondly, if we look at the historical background a little bit, I think we'll skip that. It's enough to mention that so we can get some time for Q&A. But someone mentioned, what then is the point of the sacrifices? If they're not in conflict and they were not meant for eternal salvation, what were they for? And that is something I would encourage you to study and find out. I'm still growing in this. I would recommend a book, a good book by Rabbi Joshua Berman, who has The Temple, Its Symbolism and Meaning Then and Now. He's actually from Bar-Ilan University. It's a great introduction about the basics of the temple, its symbolism, and what the sacrifices were for. Rabbi Joshua Berman, The Temple, Its Symbolism and Meaning Then and Now. Berman. So, if you imagine, I would just like for you to imagine the Garden of Eden. It was a wonderful place, communion with God every day, your relationship with Him right there. But we lost that paradise. And we were shown out of the garden. Man left the garden. Angels, cherubim blocked the way back in. But what if there was a place you could go visit heaven on earth for a little bit, where heaven and earth overlapped? It would be a little dangerous. You'd have to be very careful. Priests would help you. You could use sacrifices as a covering, but you could go visit, not just in a spiritual sense with you directly to God, wherever you are in the world, but a place where paradise on earth still exists. That is something of what the temple is biblically presented as. Finally, someone mentioned Ezekiel and the book of Ezekiel. So Christian supersessionists who say the temple is done away with and has no function whatsoever anymore for our time, they run into big problems in the book of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel describes a temple which has never historically been built. He gave the plans before the second temple was built, but they didn't build his plans. And the Jewish people today, as far as I understand, say that we will not rebuild Ezekiel. We will not build Ezekiel's temple if we rebuild, because no one except the highest of prophets could understand those plans. They would build according to the model of the second temple. And the prophets obviously didn't give the interpretation, like Haggai and Zechariah, to Ezekiel's plans when they were rebuilding. Point being, Ezekiel's temple has never been rebuilt, or has never been built in history, ever. And he describes a lot of sacrifices. He's got almost 8 complete chapters. Are those just, if the temple is done away with forever? Some theologians have tried to make that completely allegorical. Very difficult to do, because the sacrifices as described in Ezekiel is almost the same way as they're described in the Torah, and those were definitely literal, right? So what are you going to do with the book of Ezekiel then? Is it just like bonus chapters of Holy Scripture that will never happen? Theologically speaking, it doesn't work. So those are some of the big objections in Christian theology, which I think really are misunderstandings of the biblical text. And if anyone has any Q&A, we can try to do something with that. Yes, you, ma'am, in the back.
Sorry, you might have covered it. Daniel 9-12, 10-12, especially since this is Hanukkah. It appears, and then the Ezekiel chapters make perfect sense, and a friend of mine, John Schmidt, has built the model of the Ezekiel temple. It seems to fit that the third temple will have to be built, because then Daniel 10-12, you've got the one who comes in and, like Antiochus, blah, 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 erects the abomination of desolation.
So
then the Ezekiel temple is temple number 4 in the millennial kingdom.
I think a lot of people see it that way. And God only knows, right? And I'm not saying, but it seems to me if you want to harmonize the text, that would be the way that it would harmonize. And I think that's the way I approach it. If you want to read, if you missed the earlier part of the session, it's in the article in your resource magazine about the Temple of Antichrist, about Daniel specifically. But it's interesting to me, a lot of Christians don't know the fact that the Jewish people right now would not rebuild the temple according to Ezekiel's plans. That's not in the plans, because it's termed sometimes the temple of the Messiah, because he would have to interpret the plans.
It would interest me now how now those sacrifices from the Tanakh, they interact now with the sacrifice of Yeshua, how it plays together.
I skipped that part. I didn't touch on it, but so I think you can look at it this way. A lot of Christians would say that before the cross, before Golgotha, the sacrifices pointed forward to the death, the atoning death of Jesus. That's an oversimplification of the whole sacrificial system, because there's lots of other sacrifices, but fundamentally it's a Christian truth that this is the way it works. I say that's fine interpretation. That's good. Why would it be so difficult for the same sacrifices to point back towards his death after he came? The apostles certainly seemed to act as if that was the case when they brought sacrifices after his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. And if we no longer take this misunderstanding that the sacrifices were meant for salvation before he came, it's not a conflict. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, if they pointed forward before he came, why can they not point back afterwards?
You know that there is also, as far as I understand it, it's also forgiveness of sin without sacrifices. For example, David, when he committed his crime with Bathsheba, he didn't make any sacrifices. He was humbling himself, and that's for me. I mean, is it in any always needed a sacrifice? If somebody really repents in his heart, is his sacrifice of his heart enough? You know, I don't know. It's just.
I think so. I think if you were not able to bring a sacrifice, if there's no temple, for example, yes, the heart is the issue. I don't think the sacrifices were meant for that specifically. Like you are alluding to the book of Hebrews, which says that without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. But the book of Hebrews also literally says it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And again, the sacrifices can never, quote, make perfect those who draw near. So the same book that says you need blood for forgiveness says the animal sacrifices never perform that function. So I would argue, as a Christian, that Jesus' atoning death is the atonement for all time. It's a timeless event before God. God himself is outside of time. It happened in history, but it's not as if somebody sins today, Jesus would come back and die tomorrow for that. Like, it covers all sins. So you don't, in that sense, need the temple to be saved. That's the Christian misunderstanding. Any other questions?
What is the goal of Cry for Zion? What is the end result? What would you like to see?
Cry for Zion, we have the goal of specifically, there is a wonderful petition in here, and I love to share this with you guys. You can go on our website, but we also have it in your resource magazine here, the Cry for Zion petition of what really we would like to see. And it is for the Jewish people in the Jewish state, the state of Israel, to exercise sovereignty in the heart of their own capital, guaranteeing Jewish rights and freedoms on the Temple Mount according to Israeli law. Basically, that we would be able to pray on the Temple Mount. Also, Christians, that it would be like as at the Western Wall. At the Western Wall, it's a Jewish site. The Jews were there first. Then Christianity came on the scene. Later, Islam came on the scene. But nobody argues the Jews were first. If they do, they're not very historical. But the Western Wall is a Jewish site. We are welcome as Christians to come and pray. A lot do. You know, presidents, dignitaries, even to the Western Wall, and they respect it, are able to be there and connect with God. But it's the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and this Israeli law and sovereignty governs it, guaranteeing the rights of everybody. I think that would be the healthiest way.
This is how you started, actually, the whole session. But then the whole talk was really about the temple, so I see the disparity here. Is it because if you say your end result is for the Jewish people and the Jews to have the sovereignty of that geographical place, that for me is not necessarily related with the temple.
For it is for Christians. It is for Christians because as soon as you talk about the Temple Mount, they say theologically the Temple Mount does not matter, and they don't care what happens there. Some of them say. A lot of Christians say that. And therefore, it's very important to dig into the theological aspects just as it was for the state of Israel and Christian support for the Jewish state. For example, if you read Martin Luther, he says they don't have their land, so God is done with the Jewish people forever. It's been 1,500 years they have not had their land. It's over. God is obviously done with them. He didn't wait 500 enough more years, but but I understand what you're saying. Look, Bible-believing Christians do believe in the biblical texts about a future temple. Okay? We believe a lot of things. Jewish people might believe different things than Christians, but Christians are in no way advocating that something illegal be done because of that view. We don't know how it may happen. It may be hundreds of years. It may be that the Arabs invite all the Jewish people to come up and please build your temple or something. God only knows. That's not what Cry for Zion is about, but we are about theological education as well for Christians.
So I think one of the most common objections for Christians regarding the temple is that Christians would see Jesus as the temple. A lot of the things that speakers have talked about today, like the temple is the light of the world, the heart of the world, or it's the place where God will be seen. Christians is Yeshua. Yeshua, the light of the world. Yeshua, the place where we see God and we see the Father.
Okay.
So I think that in terms of the temple being the place where heaven meets earth, and for Christianity or for Christians, that's Yeshua.
So, for a quick question to repeat for the video, and this will be our last question because of time, a lot of times people say Jesus is the temple because he talks about that in the text. And the Gospel of John particularly, there's wonderful books you can get about that theologically, about the temple imagery that Jesus uses a lot about himself and the temple. So they say he's the temple, we don't need the physical anymore. This is the same approach you take to the book of Hebrews. It's either the dualistic approach, which says, you know, Jesus is now the temple. The physical temple no longer matters. Instead, I would argue that the biblical authors were trying to say that if this is true, if the physical temple in Jerusalem serves these functions and illustrates these wonderful truths and has all this amazingness, how much more is it true about Jesus? Instead, interpret them in harmony with each other instead of in conflict. That, I think, is the fundamental disconnect with replacement theology.
We're saying that like a rebuilt temple wouldn't glorify Jesus. And so if it wouldn't, you know, it's not something that would glorify Jesus. I can see it's something that Christians wouldn't oppose, but why is it something that Christians would support?
That's why we need a fresh perspective on Jesus, a relationship with the temple. And if you read his life, and we have an article about that in here called Jesus Loved the Temple Mount, we need to re-examine his relationship with God's house, who he called my Father's house. And it says, zeal for your house consumed me. And he stayed there as a 12-year-old, not wanting to leave the Temple Mount and God, his Father's house. Yeah, Avinu Shabashamayim, right? So that's how I would argue it. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm amazed. A pleasure that you came. I'm happy to take some more questions during the break, but I think that we have to call it quits for now.